Okay, so let's get started today. This webinar will be covering the Joint Development Foundation, which is the organization that helped OpenChain submit to the ISO process, and even more importantly, will be in a position to help other projects with specifications and standards of their own to change from de facto to formal standards in time. As usual, this meeting is very much a conversation, so people should feel free to dive in at any point with questions or comments. Our speaker today is Seth Newbury. Seth is the General Manager of Standards at JDF and has been a critical part of helping OpenChain, and of course, he's your key contact moving forward for all things open source and standards related. This particular webinar is important because we are now at a stage where we are in a position to have a lot of support in developing and submitting future standards. And naturally, that marks an interesting point for the entire market, where instead of depending on de facto standards, we can actually have full international standards growing to support key areas of our field. Seth, thank you so much for coming along today. And I will hand over to you for your screen share and for running through the items of the JDF, what you do, why you do it. And after that, we of course have time for Q&A.
Excellent. Well, let me turn on my video so you can sort of get an idea of who is talking to you. And now let me share my screen.
Awesome, working perfectly.
Great, good. Okay, if you've got any questions anywhere during the time, just speak up and interrupt me, and I'll do my best to answer the questions. So I'm really delighted. Shane, thanks so much for inviting me. I always love to share these with people that I don't know. So what I wanted to do is give you sort of just a general overview of Joint Development Foundation, but I also want to talk about where we are with OpenChain specification to the ISO IEC JTC1. So this will cover a lot of territory, and hopefully it'll at least entice you to ask new questions, if not now, then later. So first of all, one of the things I like to do is sort of at least establish the distinction between open source and open standards, because there's pretty formal definitions of them, but a lot of people aren't necessarily always in agreement. So basically, open standards are specifications made available to the public, and those are developed under a neutral, consensus-driven, open process. And open standards are sometimes RAND-based, meaning that they protect patents, and sometimes they are open source, where they don't protect patents. And so the greatest outcome you can have, particularly with kind of an open standard that's deriving open source, is that when you implement it, you have high confidence that you'll be able to implement it without standards essential licensing concerns down the road. Also, open standards drive a lot for interoperability, data exchange among different products and services, and so forth. So they have a slightly different entry point and exit point than an open source piece of code does, whereas the open source software is usually defined by one of the OSI's open source definitions, and I think in practice we all pretty well understand what that is because it's community driven. Linux Foundation is the best example of open source software development projects in the world. So I did this study back in 2016 when I was not associated with JDF or with the Linux Foundation, but I thought it was kind of an interesting study because we were doing some checking with the telecom industry for another association that I was supporting, and I just thought this was an interesting piece of information. So we asked the question, and there were about 400 different respondents across the telecom landscape, from operators to vendors and so forth. And we asked them, what do you think, in the scope of telecom services deployment, what do you think will be the dominant trend in the next several years? And this was 2016 when we did this. And so really our question was proprietary implementation of non-standard specifications, proprietary implementations of open standard specifications, open source implementation of open standard specifications, and open source implementations not using open standards at all. And you can see that here in the sort of the blue on the top, the blue line, that was the dominant trend. Almost 80% of these 416 respondents who answered said that we think that open source implementations of open standards are going to become a dominant trend, which I think speaks exactly to the reason that Linux Foundation and Joint Development Foundation got together, because now we've got expertise in how you develop an open standard that is well tuned for our open source community. And so we've seen other organizations like Oasis and some of the others attempting to also accommodate open source code in their standard space. But we've got a great jumpstart on this project. So the value proposition that we have was really this, and it's really in conjunction with or in contrast to the traditional way that people make a new specification setting body. And so normally you create a body that you want to go off and pursue a particular standard in a particular area. And every time you create one of these bespoke standards organizations, it literally involves hundreds of hours of lawyer time, and you're negotiating all the working rules and the licensing terms and the copyrights and the patents and the trademark and all the things that are related to that effort. And they take months, literally months. We've seen them take just forever. And so you've got hundreds of lawyer hours in all of the founding companies. And our question was, and then the sixth company comes along and just signs the agreement. We said, well, how do we get to the sixth guy first? And so that was what sort of drove us into creating the value proposition for JDF. And then once you've created the entity, you've got to, or once you've created the rules for the entity, you've got to create the entity itself, right? You need to file a 501c6 for nonprofit status. You need to set up bank accounts, accounting, finance, all the operational stuff. You've got to collect fees from your members, file taxes like just any other commercial company. And that is terribly, terribly expensive to do. And so anyway, so before anybody knows what the output will be, before the first technical contribution even gets made, you could be 6-9 months down the road before your engineers can actually get started. And we frankly just wanted to solve that problem. And so what we did is we created the standards organization in a box. And so, you just pick from a limited series of options, give the effort a name and off you go. So we kind of create all this custom negotiation with a check the box model. So for things like how you're going to set up your governance, specifically around steering members versus other kinds of memberships, how you're going to collect fees if it's a funded project, what your copyright, what your intellectual property rights, and what your source code licensing is going to be as each associated with the particular working groups that you want to set up. And once those terms are in place, the new project is formed as what I call, and you see me use a quote here, a subsidiary entity under the nonprofit JDF umbrella. It's known as a series LLC. And so what that does is the JDF has already got the 501c6. We already file all the paperwork with the government. We already file the annual Form 990s, which is the tax filings for the nonprofit. We maintain the status. Linux Foundation does the accounting for us. Linux Foundation helps us do the membership. So all the really basic infrastructure is in place today, right away. And so you can be up and running in a couple of weeks. We've seen it done. So it's as long as you're willing to use sort of the standard templates and the standard process, which are all best of breed. Everybody who reads them, there are hundreds of companies, big companies that have joined JDF projects and are quite satisfied with the way it comes together. And so basically what we've done is we've tried to keep the cost of the effort so low that a specification project can be established without any funding at all needed for the creation of the ongoing or the management of the ongoing entity. Now, for an unfunded project, you don't get that much support. But frankly, if you want to get 4 or 5 companies together, you want to write a white paper and find out if, you know, there's some important thing you can come up with in an early stage or a pre-standardization stage, it's a really safe way to go do it. Now, everything I described is pretty quick, but one of the other things that we've been looking at, because it's still kind of paperwork intensive once you get it started, you're still dealing with working group charters, which are essentially the contributor license agreements and so forth. So one of the more recent innovations that we've just announced back in June, I believe, where we wanted a simpler way to get something started. And so we created what's called the JDF Community Specifications. And they entail a slightly different licensing model, but it's still based upon all of the normal things you would recognize. But it's simplified. It's got a one-size-fits-all in this particular one. We published a set of governance and licensing templates for the communities to use and to clone right out of a repository. So we call this a repository-based standards effort. And the community specification templates incorporate the terms and procedures required for the standards, very similar to the existing JDF product we have, the larger, more standardized forms that I just described, but in a much faster term that doesn't even require you to set up an entity. If you wanted to just roll up a project and use these terms, you can. And then that entity could, in fact, if you wanted, become an entity and move more fully into the JDF realm seamlessly. And ultimately, they can also evolve into an international specification, which I'm going to talk more about because that's sort of what's important to the folks here at OpenChain, because you are our first international specification. So by and large, what we've done is we've really tried to simplify the kind of the agonizing part of putting a specification together, which is actually creating the entity. Once the engineers get going there, they usually are just fine. And then we've tried to even streamline that process so that you don't require almost any signatures in order to start one up. So the community specifications are kind of a new product that we're putting out there that we're just now really starting to see some interest in. So just one more thing, and I'm not going to read through this, but I just want to point you to the link on this particular page here, which is the GitHub, which talks about the community specification. We're in our 1.0 specification revision of this project, which again has all of the general kinds of components that we do in our existing JDF. It's just even a little more simplified, and it requires like a CLA bot in order to make sure that the contributions are being covered by the licenses here. So much less cost involved and much less human intervention required to help support a new project. So if you've got something interesting, something you'd like to just quickly, as OpenChain, go try to put a specification together with, this could be a really fast way of getting there. Mike Dolan, Scott Nicholas, they're all fully aware of this. And so this is being kind of rolled out in some of the new projects that we're doing now. Now, moving on. So one of the things that we did during the winter, early in the year, we applied to JTC1 ISO IEC to become an authorized PAS submitter. So PAS stands for Publicly Available Specification. So ISO is the international body with a membership of 164 national standards bodies, widely recognized throughout the world. The IEC is the world's leading organization for international standards for all electrical and electronic technologies. ISO and IEC joined to create JTC1, which is the international group dedicated to developing worldwide information and technology standards. So there are 13 recognized PAS submitters in JTC1. We are one of them, and we became one in the spring. Very shortly thereafter, well, excuse me. So the reason that pass is important is that because when we submit a specification to pass and it is accepted and balloted and ultimately accepted, it becomes an international specification. So other countries can transpose it. They can make it law in their own country, depending on the nature of what they want from it. And so it is an international standard. It has the same force as an ISO standard. Now there's maintenance that we have to do. There's, you know, we have to stay on top of it. We have to edit and maintain the submission. And we have to reapply for pass status depends if it's JTC1, it's 6 years. If it's ISO, I think it's 5 years. But it's one of those things that we've got the infrastructure to do, and we're very proud that we got there. So one of the things that's really interesting, you know, ISO has this incredibly specific and arcane format for the physical appearance and submission of the document, which is why my picture of the Hogwarts School of Magic, I think, is the only place they teach this kind of editorial work. And so what normally happens, and what we did with OpenChain, is we took that source document from the Linux Foundation project and we converted it into a compliant format for ISO. We have some specialist editors who perform that work, and it takes quite a while to do it. We just recently finished the SPDX specification as well, and that was, you know, OpenChain was about 12 or 15 pages, SPDX is about 160 pages, and so that was clearly a much larger project for us, and we're hoping soon to submit that. I'll talk about that in a minute. So within JDF, we created a project called JDF International. So JDF International is in fact a legal entity underneath JDF, just like any one of our working groups, or any one of our other projects like Alliance for Open Media or Open Manufacturing Platform or any. It's its own standalone entity, but it's underneath the JDF legal umbrella. And then within the JDF International umbrella, we create a working group for each specification from each project. So there is a working group for OpenChain, and in that working group, we can define the inbound and outbound copyright licensing and all of the ownership of the specification, with the objective of just ensuring that there is a contiguous bidirectional pipeline that ensures the ownership and maintenance of the specification remains with OpenChain. So essentially what happens is that the LF project specification comes in, that would be OpenChain, that goes to JDF International Working Group, or its particular working group underneath JDF International, and then that goes to JTC1. And if JTC1 comes back and says, hey, we've got comments, and we do expect comments, then that flows backwards through that same pipeline. But what that really allows you to do is it ensures that you won't lose control of the specification. So edits, updates, and so forth will remain with the originator, which is you guys. Any questions so far? Okay. So the OpenChain specification. Oh, yes.
Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I have one question. My name is Fukuchi, Hiroki Fukuchi, and I want to know the benefit of becoming both open standard and ISO standard.
Well, they're related, but they are different. So not, you know, a standard, and I'm certain that you are all quite sophisticated at this, so forgive me if I'm saying things that are obvious, but you know, every standard has its own purpose, and in some of them are more important than others. Some standards never thrive, right? They're never adopted. Some people get together, they think they've got a good idea, but it doesn't really thrive. And those are fine. There's nothing wrong with that, because you have the protection of the standards body to help against things like antitrust, to help you define working rules that are fair, and so forth. So the standard itself, the body that makes up the standards body, is for your protection. But when you make the standard itself, so really a standard is a set of ideas that tell you how to implement a solution to a problem, but they don't always include code. Now, many standards today are more code forward. So they can sort of start with code and then they build the standard around it, sort of to define the architecture into which the code is expected to work, or what are the interfaces on either end of the specification that are going to work. But the standard itself usually is just a set of ideas. And so, but if you get a good one and it really solves a problem, then you want to create test specifications underneath it. You want to be able to make sure that it's interoperable. In really advanced standards, you'll put conformance tests in, things like that. But having the standard that works interoperably, let's use short message service as an example. Back around 2000s, 2001, 2002, if you wanted to send a text message on a network, you could maybe send the text message from one AT&T or KDDI or to another person in that inside that network. But it wasn't until the standard came out that you could interoperate across operators, across devices, and across regions. So the standard sort of tells you, how do I lay it all out, and then people begin to implement the standard using their own code, their own bespoke implementations. Oftentimes standards. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. You mean the ISO standard has a critical trust over the specification, so it is worth to becoming ISO standard. Is that correct?
It does, because what happens is that achieving ISO standardization, achieving the ISO stamp of approval is quite important, because you will find that more people will adopt the standard. In particular, I have seen where standards bodies, for example, will come up with really great standards, and then maybe you'll want to go to a Chinese company, and for whatever reason, the Chinese companies really want to see not that I'm going to a small standards body like an OASIS standard and implementing that. They want to see an international standard where they know everybody is there. And so the ISO determination can be very, very important to really widespread worldwide adoption. And that's its benefit.
Thank you very much. I understand.
Okay, well, I hope that was helpful. Any other questions while I'm... Okay, so the OpenChain, we submitted that specification to JTC1 back in February of 2020. So today, that past submission it's in Geneva, it's being processed. It's appeared in the ISO database. The balloting launched in June, at the end of June, and it'll conclude at the end of September. So quite soon, we expect to see how we did with the OpenChain specification. And we were really delighted to start with it. This is probably the best specification we could have started with, simply because it's very compact, it's easy to consume, it's not very long, and it's well written. So we're hoping to see, so what will happen is that, and again, this is our first one, so I'll be honest, I'm not exactly positive about when all the dates will happen, but we would expect to see sometime in late September a list of questions. There may be edits, there may be questions, there may be some of these things that we receive that are simply requirements in order to make it look exactly the way an ISO standard is supposed to look. We did our very best to edit it in a fashion that was going to be acceptable to them, but these, as I say, these editorial standards that they have are quite, they're really specific and really expert. There are not a lot of people who can do it. So we should expect to see some editorial comments, and maybe some functional comments, and possibly even some content comments. For example, we found a typo in it when we were reviewing it, and we're going to submit that as an errata right at the very end. We happen to reference Linux Foundation as opposed to Joint Development Foundation, which is a minor issue, but we want to get it right. So we're going to submit that, but we're going to submit it nearer the end so that it won't create a lot of comments in the interim. So also, and again, I don't know which languages, if any, the national standards bodies translated the document into their own native language. I think we're going to learn a lot when we see the result coming at the end of September. I think it'll be quite instructional, and we should probably schedule kind of a time with all of the project people just to sort of review what happened. We can also, if we found that we found an error, we can also correct ours during midstream if we discover one. Also, if there are new revisions to the OpenChain standard, we can then start a new process to keep updating it. It shouldn't be quite as difficult as the first one, but that's something we'll want to continue to maintain the OpenChain specification, add to it, bring it along as time goes on. Any questions about this slide? So one of the next one is the SPDX. I mentioned this. So Linux Foundation SPDX version 2.2.1 is our second specification to be submitted through JDF to ISO IEC JTC1. This, in brief, is it's an open standard for communicating software bill of materials information, including components, licenses, copyrights, and so forth. It's a much longer, about 150 pages, and we are in the very, very, very final fine-tuning stage. We are literally dotting I's and crossing T's, and we expect to be, hopefully the last review session will happen on Tuesday. And so we hope to extend it to JTC1 late this week or early the following week. So that will be the next Linux Foundation product coming into the SPDX, or excuse me, the pass process. And truthfully, we're looking for more, because one of the things I find fascinating, and this is kind of just as an aside, but what we do, when we submit this specification, we submit it through ANSI. So ANSI is the national standards body that we tend to send it in through to JTC1. And one of the things we're finding is we're looking and we're seeing what ISO is, both ISO and ANSI kind of combined, they're doing an awful lot of surveying about what the future of this international specification world is. And I will tell you, they seem to be struggling with how to manage open source. It's not obvious to them. And I think that Linux Foundation through JDF really has a seat at the table here. I think the opportunity for us to be, what's the word I'm looking for, very influential in this international standardization effort, if we can source it and staff it and get the kind of expertise that we'd like from our collaborators and members, could be a really important future step for Linux Foundation and JDF. So I think we've touched on something important. We're, I think, slowly and methodically getting ourselves involved with the international standards world, and I'm hoping for great success. So that's sort of everything that I have right now. I think I kind of took my 15, actually about 25 minutes. We are always interested in helping projects add a specification to their body of work. This is really what, when Jim Zemlin looked at JDF and said, this is something we really want to add to the work and the capability of JDF, of Linux Foundation. We've been delighted to be part of this. We could not have landed in a better place. Certainly JDF or LF is a big organization. We aren't quite as nimble as we were, because we're all trying to figure out how to work operationally well with Linux Foundation, match into their systems and all of that sort of thing. But truthfully, it's been a great marriage. I couldn't be happier with where we stand and where I think we're going. And we think that adding that sort of specification component around one of the larger open source projects is a really powerful adjunct. We're vertically integrating up and down the code and specification chain. So, you know, we'd love to help you. If you think you see an opportunity or a need in your community, let us know. We're happy to help however we can. And truthfully, we're just grateful for you hearing us out and learning a little bit more about us.
So if it's okay, Seth, I'd like to throw the first question into the field. It's really got to do with the perception in some areas of open source that becoming a formal standard is difficult, or that there might be pushback from traditional standardization space. Now it seems JDF directly helps solve the challenge, the difficulty of becoming a standard. Do you have any insight into to what degree JDF can help communicate to traditional standardization, and to what degree there might be any politics or pushback from people who are wholly from the standards area and people who are wholly from open source?
Yeah, it was interesting. You remember that survey I showed you at the very beginning, and there were like 30 questions we asked during that survey. And one of the things that was interesting is that the people who were traditional open source people had zero use for standards. They just said, "Yeah, don't need it. We don't think we're going to be any better off with you guys or not." But a lot of the standards-oriented people really felt that there was something to be gained from communicating and conveying more work with this open source community. And so, people who are real open source developers, they're really happy with what they're doing. And frankly, we're happy that they're happy with what they're doing. But what happens is something becomes increasingly complex. Then open source can exist in and of itself and do fine. But over time, one of the things that doesn't work, a specification or a standard is not operating instructions, right? It tends to be, it defines the architecture, it defines the inputs and outputs, it defines the use cases under which a piece of code might be used, and it defines expected behavior for what that code's going to do. So that implementers who might want to take a particular bind of an open source piece of software, but have the advantage of having a specification around it, can sometimes make that code more efficient, more effective, and more reliable across a multi-vendor environment. And so there's a lot of cases where open source communities in particular flat out don't need us. And that's great, because we want to let the open source guys be the open source people. We want to do what they're comfortable with doing. But what happens is, in the last 10 years, everything is software, right? It's all white box hardware running bespoke software, and increasingly a lot of that software, and particularly communication plumbing and so forth, is open source, but you like to standardize on it. And so that's the value where that's where we can meet a need that the open source community might have sometimes. So we're very happy to do that where it's necessary. At the same time, there's a lot of things, I think also, my personal experience tends to be in telecom and networking. So, there's a lot of things where you're looking at performance, you're looking at how we're going to get a very, low latency, not very chatty, once in a while kind of IoT style message from point A to point B. And so you're starting from a situation where there is no code, there's nothing there. You're making up, you're conceptualizing the highway or the infrastructure that some future service is going to run on. And so from there, you're absolutely just starting with an idea. And a specification is a really good way of doing that, because the process of building a spec is pretty procedural, right? Start with your use cases, do your architecture, build your technical specs around it, build a test spec around it, and also be careful about what's going on with the IPR, because if you want to make sure that that open source, open standard can be implemented by open source developers without worrying about licenses, that kind of diligence and that kind of infrastructure is super important. And then what happens is that the open source guys come in and they start writing reference code and they start writing operational code on top of that specification as an implementer. So you get some specifications that are code where code follows. You're getting some specifications where the code is there, but they need to write the architecture around that code. And a specification is a really good vehicle for doing that in an organized fashion. So yeah, they can be complementary. Oftentimes they are, but smaller projects or projects that are really fluid, sometimes those should just be code, because that's the fastest way to get there. You know, and so if you compare a small, go look at 3GPP or one of these, you know, these guys that are developing 5G. That takes forever. It's 1,000 people. It's big iron. It's a lot of work, and you know how long that takes. And not everything falls into that category. And a lot of the open source community hates the idea of going through that. And truthfully, I'll be honest with you, what drew me personally to JDF was the fact that in some of the other standards bodies I've been working with, we were trying to use those tools that developers use, like GitHub, like Confluence and so forth, which today seems old school, but back then, what you had a Word document that was a baseline. You did change requests. You walk through the change requests. You created a new baseline, and you just did that over and over and over again. And then when you publish the spec, nobody reviewed it, right? No one. Now you do this all on you know, developer tools like GitHub, Confluence, Atlassian, and so forth. And suddenly the whole community is watching what you're doing, and they're throwing a lot of information in that can be very valuable. So we just see it as the modernization of really kind of a very venerable kind of industry that standards has been in the past.
That makes a lot of sense. Throwing open the door to everyone, if there is another question from the audience. Okay, so if there's no other question from the audience right now, the last thing I just wanted to touch on, the community specification, you discussed it a little bit in your slides.
Mm-hmm.
This is something pretty new, I think. You know, people might look at it if they come out of open source and think, well, you know, it makes sense, specification building in a box, it's hosted on GitHub. But I think this might be an innovation in that, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been anything like this before.
That's right. This is sort of the next brainchild, because I will tell you that when we do a bigger project, there's still a lot of document handling. Right? You've got to make sure that everybody has a working group charter. You've got to make sure that people who are contributing their ideas to the specification are covered under the working group charter. So there's still a lot of manual intervention, and you're also dealing with, you know, a source code and an IPR and a copyright license. So one of the things we did is, for example, the community specification license is sort of one. We rolled it in. It's its own thing. It's kind of new, and it covers all of those, and you can sort of see how it works. It covers the source code distributions. It covers copyright. It covers IP, and it is new. It's a very new thing, and I'm unaware of anybody who has done anything like this in the past. And so David Rudin, who is the open source attorney for Microsoft and actually founded the Joint Development Foundation before we were merged into JDF, has been working on this for a while. So Mike Dolan and Scott Nicholas, they've also been through this. We're really hoping to run some community specification projects inside LF. I think one of the early ones we're hoping to try it out on is Trust over IP. But yes, you're right. It is new, and truthfully, we think it's we think it's fit for purpose for an awful lot of efforts that want to start up. But it's also contiguous with all of the existing JDF documentation. So you can move from this into a more standard, larger funded JDF project. And then if you're in that, you can move up to the international standard. And so this truly and truly is, you know, a few guys in a garage moving from a really good idea to something that could be an international specification pretty seamlessly. And so, yes, it is exciting. I'm sure that we are going to be debugging this for a little bit over the next year, but its basis is the JDF documents. We actually went from the JDF documents, which have been well proven, backwards to a simpler style of administration. So this is almost kind of an operational change to the process that makes it faster and easier to get something started. And so I invite you to go to that link, because that you can see everything that's in it.
Yeah, the whole thing is right there. It's pretty cool. And just out of kind of a devil's advocate, do you have any concerns that people might make stupid standards?
Absolutely. People make stupid standards all the time. We just want it to be cheaper to make a stupid standard and realize it's a stupid standard, rather than spend $100,000 of lawyer hours in order to create an organization that takes you a year to shut down. I have to tell you, my personal experience after doing this for about 20 years is that most standards bodies outlive their usefulness, because they start employing staff, people like them, they get used to it, they like the travel, whatever, and so they wind up not dying when they should. And so the lower the hurdle to starting something, that you can try it, see if it works. If it starts to work, you can grow something, or that's really simple to shut down. Those are good for the industry.
Now, I saw that Jim Hutchinson had a question. Jim, I'll just pause here to give you a chance to ask it.
You made a comment that standards bodies, which they do seem to be very procedural, and I think they have procedures and books for their procedures on procedures. Mm-hmm. What body has a standard that doesn't actually experience review? You mentioned that they don't have review of the specifications, people don't read them. Wasn't sure what you meant. Maybe it was
let me explain myself, because I wasn't referring to something that's procedural. So I'm going to give you an example. There's another standards body that I have worked for in the past, and we published the old-fashioned way. And so we would create a large document around a particular specification, publish it as a PDF, put it out for public review, and over the life of this particular organization, mm-hmm. we'd get a dozen comments on a mm-hmm. good one. Then we started using GitHub, and we started putting it out in the developer community, and we got hundreds of comments, and they were good comments. They really helped us. They gave us a lot, because the whole developer community was looking for a solution. Mm-hmm. And they sort of saw this and said, wow, maybe this is a part of it. So they we all believe this about open source, right? The big tent will make you a really good product. Now, it can, the big tent is also, it's messy, right? It's a lot of people.
Tent is, but it sounds nice.
Yeah. So that's what I meant.
Okay. I'm familiar with Etsy 3GPP, where
exactly
they use these archaic FTP servers, but they have a V&V period that's kind of long, and sometimes people trot out their old issues and give them one more go. Yep. But they're usually not without comment.
Okay. No. And Etsy is a standard somewhere. Yeah, and Etsy is such an important body. Mm-hmm. That Etsy and 3GPP, those two are such big and important bodies. They're always going to get it. But if you look at some of the smaller ones, ECMA, Oasis, and those are bigger ones too. some of the little guys, LoRa Alliance and so forth, they get to be pretty specific, and you might not get that much commentary on some of those things because they're pretty small.
Sure. Yeah. IETF gets lots of response, but it's sometimes hard to figure out whether it's some sort of oblique comment or not. But yeah, a lot of bright minds there.
Yeah, there are a lot of bright minds, and and they want to let you know that they're a bright mind, and so. But yes, they're very procedural, and one of the things that we've tried to do, kind of operationally, is make sure, because one of the things traditional standards bodies, you can throw objections, and you can wind up losing an awful lot of momentum in a traditional standards body. Somebody can take you way, way back because you didn't consider this in the architecture and so forth. Yep. And that's why having a process and having a procedure, and truthfully, a specification, we've got a huge manual about what to do in case of X, right? And because if you don't, with a standard, it's sort of like organized warfare in a lot of ways. And you got to make sure that the rule book is pre-built so that when somebody says, no, I object, what's a supermajority mean? Or all those rules need to be in place. Open source code is very different because if somebody just doesn't like the code, they're just going to ignore it. Or the moderator, or the community moderator won't merge the pull request. So there's real differences in kind of the attitude and the objectives of each community, and so what we've tried to do is we try to get more of the open source mentality into the specification setting part.
Yeah, that makes sense, and you've really done a marvelous job with the OpenChain spec to go into ISO. Well,
that was you guys. We just did it in the ISO colored crayon, and hopefully they're going to be happy with it. But the product was yours, and that's what counts.
Getting there. I don't know if you can vote against yourself on that one. I think that's a significant activity.
Fantastic. Any further questions? All right. If there are no further questions, Seth, thank you so much. I think it's been very valuable to have you here today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It was really fun.
Yeah, it was great to have you here. And the information you shared with us today will disseminate across the OpenChain community over time. And I think you'll probably be hearing from people with questions and comments of things that would be separate from OpenChain as well. So much appreciate your time.
That's great. And I'm looking forward to seeing where the balloting goes so that we can have another conversation to celebrate your success.
Oh, as are we all. And everyone, thank you for being here. Thanks for some great questions, and talk to you all soon.